Hello everyone, and welcome back to the second half of our Day 2 programming for Cleantech Export Week. My name is Lynn Cote, EDC's Cleantech lead, and I have the privilege of kicking off our second half of the day by announcing our final Ones to Watch winner. Congratulations to Quadrant from Burnaby, British Columbia. As you will see in this video, Quadrant builds customized biogas cleanup systems that allow wastewater treatment plants, landfills, agricultural digesters, and power generation facilities to turn waste biogas into clean energy. Please join me in congratulating Quadrant on their award.
Quadrant designs, builds, and delivers biogas cleanup and upgrading systems. These systems enable our customers to process biogas into biomethane or renewable natural gas, which can be injected to the pipeline or can be used as transportation fuel. We replace fossil fuels with renewable natural gas, which enable us to achieve a zero carbon footprint once we can use CO2 present in biogas for greenhouse applications or any other industrial applications that will enable us to achieve negative carbon footprint. From the day one, we have been 100% export-oriented company. We have exported from the beginning to the US, and then from US, we expanded our business to China, Europe, South America, and Asia. We met EDC at the commercialization stage when we needed the bank guarantee and some working capital loan to execute the project. With their help, we have grown more than 100% on year-to-year basis. Our goal is to be number one company in the world in the biogas space. With our trusted partner such as EDC, we are going to deploy our products and services all over the world.
Congratulations again to the team at Quadrant. We look forward to following your continued growth. I now would like to introduce our next panel session. At EDC, we're very grateful to our many cleantech partners who work with us in tandem to support Canada's cleantech industry. To bring visibility to our partnerships and their unique program offerings, this year we've invited MaRS to host the next panel. There's no doubt that MaRS is a leading institution, and programs such as their Mission from MaRS prove that. Mission from MaRS is an ambitious technology adoption program aimed at addressing some of the greatest challenges facing our society by rapidly accelerating the widespread deployment of Canada's most effective innovations to address climate change, sustainability, and carbon reduction. EDC is a proud sponsor of the Mission from MaRS program. This panel will provide an overview of the Mission from MaRS program and highlight 3 program participants who are leading the charge in helping society to meet our climate goals. I'm delighted that Tyler Hamilton, MaRS's Director of Ecosystem Cleantech, will moderate the panel. Previous to joining MaRS, Tyler spent 2 decades as a journalist and wrote extensively about Canada's clean technology sector and global clean tech trends. Most recently, he was editor-in-chief of Business and Sustainability magazine Corporate Knights. He also spent 13 years at the Toronto Star, where he reported on Canada's energy sector and wrote a popular weekly column on clean energy technologies and trends. In 2011, Tyler authored Mad Like Tesla, a book that examines the various barriers to clean energy innovation and surveys the landscape of some potentially world-changing clean technologies. A recipient of the Cleantech Group's Pioneer Award for his early writings on the sector, Tyler was also recognized in 2016 on Canada's Clean 50 list for his thought leadership on clean energy and climate issues. Tyler, thank you for hosting this session. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Lynn. I really appreciate that intro. And thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon or morning, depending on where you're connecting from. Earlier this year, as Lynn mentioned, MaRS launched its Mission from MaRS Climate Impact Challenge. a tech adoption program designed to really speed up the deployment of Canada's most impactful climate innovations, specifically those that could help draw down GHG emissions in real estate, transportation, and energy, which together represent the vast majority of CO2 emissions globally. After a national recruitment campaign, we selected a cohort of 10 high potential ventures, and since June, we have been working with these ventures to really better understand the barriers to the adoption they face, and to help them come up with strategies for overcoming those barriers. Now, helping us on this mission are representatives from across industry with support from very important partners such as EDC, as well as BDC, HSBC, RBC, a lot of acronyms there, Mitsubishi, and members of the philanthropic community, including groups like the Trottier Family Foundation, Gilgan Foundation, and Thistledown Foundation. Over the next several months and beyond, our hope is to give our cohort ventures stronger traction in the marketplace, and I'm honored to introduce you to 3 of those ventures today. Starting with Brainbox AI, represented by CEO Sam Ramadori, Flash Forest, represented by Chief Operating Officer Cameron Jones, and Peak Power, represented by Mike Skrzyński, Director of Strategy and Corporate Development. Sam, Cameron, Mike, thanks to the 3 of you for participating this afternoon. So to kick this off, I want to begin giving you each 2 minutes or less to share a little bit about what your company does and to kind of describe the product and service that you sell. And why don't we go in alphabetical order here, and we'll start with Sam at Brainbox.
Perfect, thanks. One of the small advantages of starting with a B, I guess. So thank you for having us. Really quickly, Brainbox AI, we're a Montreal-based company. Our focus since the beginning has been applying artificial intelligence, and specifically autonomous artificial intelligence, to the built environment, and specifically the heating and ventilation systems of buildings. And the goal there is, I think you'll read it in many reports, the built environment is responsible for a significant percentage of GHG emissions given the amount of energy they consume. And within a building, the single biggest chunk by far is the heating and ventilation systems. So our goal was to really take advantage of what autonomous artificial intelligence is able to bring to the table in terms of having this self-learning capability, because each building, one of the problems with buildings is each one is different, right? So you have to go to each building and study how it operates specifically. So the AI is able to self-learn the operations of that building, and then take that rich data set from the building and then marrying it with outside data like weather or tariff structures, utility tariff structures, and then have a system that then autonomously, having understood that building specifically, is able to run it and optimize it significantly. So we started the journey about 4 or 5 years ago, and then launched to the market a little bit over 2 years ago. And here we are. Hopefully that's 2 minutes, Tyler.
That's great. Thanks, Sam. Cameron, over to you. Tell us a bit about Flash Forest.
Sure. Thanks for having me on this panel, Tyler and MaRS. Really appreciate it. So my name is Cameron Jones. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Flash Forest, where we use drones to plant trees. Every year, the planet loses at least 15 billion trees. We're replanting about 8 billion of which, that's the average. Some years it's as high as 50 billion. So we're really trying to tilt the scales for environmental reclamation and for climate change. And what we do is we develop our own firing systems that we augment drones with. We have machine learning software, which helps us identify where we plant, what's the optimal place to plant trees when you're flying over a forest, especially if you're doing, tens of thousands of hectares. You can't do it by hand. You need machine learning to really make that a more efficient process. And then most importantly, we develop our own seed pods, and we've invested very, very heavily in this. But what we use are pods that we fill with seeds, different species across Canada, fire it into the soil so that it germinates and turns into a tree. And in Canada, we work in British Columbia, Alberta, and Ontario. Right now, we're expanding our horizons to go to the Netherlands in the spring and beyond after that. So that's the short and sweet of it.
Super interesting, and particularly when countries like Canada have made pretty bold commitments around planting trees by 2030. So good to see your innovation tackling that issue. Mike, tell us about Peak Power and what you guys are doing in the marketplace.
Sounds good. Thanks, Tyler, and thanks for having me here. Very excited to be on the panel.
Our pleasure.
So Peak Power, for those who aren't familiar, ultimately we see ourselves as a software company that optimizes the operation of multi-asset virtual power plants. Now, that's a nice long statement. What does that mean? Ultimately, it means we optimize three primary types of assets. We start off with battery energy storage system and providing services to the grid. We also optimize buildings for electricity grid events. And then third, we also optimize electric vehicle chargers, both from the perspective of throttling chargers during key grid moments, but also using battery capacity in EVs to actually act as basically another source of energy for the building. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is enable virtual power plants in the urban environment by connecting them to the electricity grid and helping essentially these contributors to climate change, i.e. buildings, the energy sector, and transport, to become part of the solution by targeting their energy reductions to the times that are most expensive, but also the most polluting.
Super neat. Okay, sticking with you, Mike, and the next question I'm going to ask all of you to answer, but we'll start with Mike this time. How has your pitch to potential buyers changed over the past few years? And the context for that is, have you noticed buyers putting greater weight on the emission reduction potential versus just being hyper focused on cost?
Yeah, and certainly as we're touch wood exiting, put the worst of COVID behind us, there has been a change in the tone. Cost is certainly still on the table, as it always is, but there's definitely a lot more interest in the carbon reduction aspects of what we're doing. Like I was giving a pitch the other week, and I see more and more when we say, oh, well, we target these reductions to help reduce your emissions. Like, wait, stop, like, tell me more about that, or tell me more about how you can quantify these reductions in real time. So there's certainly a lot more interest around that as we're coming out of COVID, and there's more emphasis on resilience, but also keeping warming within 1.5 degrees. That's certainly become a much broader part of the discussions that we're having.
Sam, you're targeting a lot of the same customers in the building space and real estate market. Similar question, but I guess the lens that a lot of customers are seeing this through is that whole net zero and decarbonization lens. Are you also seeing greater pull for the emission reduction aspect of your solution versus just the pure cost?
Yeah, no, I would say it's a sea change. When I started at Brainbox, we were still a small group of people, so we did a lot of I did a lot of the pounding of the pavement at the beginning and presenting the solution to customers directly. And definitely, though, at the time there was a lot of ROI. It was actually a little bit discouraging when you left the meeting when you thought of the balance of that ROI, return on investment, versus the decarbonization side. The last 2 years has been a complete shift, and sometimes you wonder whether you're in your own little bubble and notice things too much. But I've had conversations with other people in the industry that deal with HVAC systems, service providers, et cetera, and even the traditional service providers, and even they say the amount of capital available now to pursue decarbonization goals is something they've never seen before. And some people have been in the industry 20, 30 years. So for us, we definitely see there's a big shift there. Maybe playing catch up to the way things have been in Europe for a number of years. I don't know, but the shift is very real.
Yeah. Cameron, you're in a completely different market here, and Flash Forest is a relatively young company. So I don't know if you've even noticed since Flash Forest got started, any kind of change in the pull on the GH, because really the whole idea of tree planting, it's really focused on drawing down emissions, right? So maybe you could provide a different perspective here.
Yeah, and I would also totally agree with what Mike shared. Cost is still a factor. Now, when we got into this game, carbon sequestration was one of our core mandates. So like you said, that's already been a pillar of our business. Cost is a factor. It'll continue to be a factor. But the main shift I think we've observed is the types of clients that are now reaching out to us, right? Before, we had clients that had to plant trees. This was already kind of a regulatory obligation. Now we're getting this big influx of, these Fortune 100 companies, these municipalities that now want to plant trees either because of the carbon offset potential or because they want to clean up their environmental image. And that's becoming a much bigger share of our business now, I think, because of this kind of global conversation that's happening. People are hearing about the fires that are happening globally every year. Climate change is not getting better. We're observing it firsthand with the forest fires that just swept through Western Canada. Like, there's no denying it. So we found the types of customers that we're getting now are those that are very focused on climate change. They're focused on offsets. They want to focus on this now as a share of their business that maybe wasn't there before. And so, yeah, I would say that's kind of one of the big shifts we've seen.
But is it genuine? Like, is it, do you see it as greenwashing, or all these net zero commitments and reports coming out? Are companies actually starting to walk the talk?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, because my suspicion always was that this was going to be more fleeting customer bracket. It was going to be a more short-term customer segment. Right now, the social winds are blowing with this climate change talk, right? Greta Thunberg, we're hearing about the forest fires. It's hot right now, pun intended. So I anticipated that this would be a bit more of a short-lived customer segment that would come in really hot, but it wouldn't be sustained. Whereas those that have, the regulatory obligation to plant trees would be a more lasting customer bracket. But that hasn't been what we've found. Like, you're right, we're only 2 years old, but these customers are the easiest ones to actually put their money where their mouth is. They're the first ones to pay, the ones that are interested in the carbon offsets. They're the most eager ones, and they're the ones that want to scale the fastest. They want to go into the millions of trees as fast as we can because of the carbon offset potential. So my whole impression of it has also shifted. I'm less skeptical. I see this as more of a lasting and growing segment.
And if, to build on that, on the real estate side, I mean, we certainly see more and more customers and prospects that are certainly that never even considered ESG are now saying, wait a minute, how do we do this, right? And, cost and finances are certainly an aspect, but now I think there's this realization that, wait, climate risk is real, and that's being priced in accordingly. And then secondly, you're kind of seeing, on the real estate side, a bit of a, what I think call a green sandwich, if you will. On the one hand, you have tenants that are pushing for green leases, trying to reduce their scope 2 emissions, demanding that building owners meet certain metrics. But then on the flip side, you have the regulatory pushes. You have institutional investors that are now looking at climate risk, and then mandating that, wait a minute, if you don't have a strategy to mitigate this, then we're not going to fund your assets, quite simply. So you have the investors and the customers both kind of pushing for this, hold on, like, you need to make sure there's a plan to mitigate this.
Sam, I saw you nodding there. Is that your opinion too?
Yeah, I mean, the one analogy I try to point to is, I mean, if you were invested in coal 10 years ago, you just got your head handed to you. That sector, ignore the recent spike, that whole sector took a while. Oil and gas, the executives look like deer in the headlights, right? That their lives has changed in the last 5 years. They're facing lawsuits, et cetera, issues around their reserves valuation, et cetera. That's just going down the list of what's emitting carbon in our world. How long is it going to be before people now return their attention to real estate, as Mike is saying, right? So, once oil's taken care of, what's next? So it's just a matter of a moving target. So the feeling we get, and I really echo Mike's comments, people that naturally would not have been your strongest proponents of decarbonization, suddenly even them, further down the list are starting to wake up and say, look, we better do something now before the freight train, hits us, 2-3 years down the road. I mean, that's a reality.
So we've talked about market demand, but where is regulation? Where's the role there? Is it helping or hindering you? Like, I'm not sure, Cameron, if you face regulation or if it's more about the way policy is structured to enable companies like you to do things. But maybe you can talk about that.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's a great question. So the regulatory framework in Canada, especially as it pertains to tree planting, has not really changed a whole lot in recent years. And government, it takes a while to change policy. It takes a while to change regulations, and we're providing a kind of net new model. We're not planting trees, we're planting seeds. We have a lot of different requirements to be able to do this. In terms of like there being a regulatory obstacle, we're actually in the middle of finding that out right now. So we have some applications right now to get some regulatory maybe provisions that allow us to really prove out this model and this type of business in Canada. The main regulatory challenge, I'll tell you point blank, I think it's the lack of clarity and consistency on carbon offsets in Canada. Some countries have really dialed it in, and Canada is such a progressive Western developed country that is also very eager on, carbon offsets and to clean up our emissions portfolio, but there isn't that clarity and that consistency across Canada with carbon offsets. So right now, as a company, we have to work in like voluntary markets much sooner than we can work in the compliance market, because it's not clear enough yet. And that's one area like regulatory envelope I would like to push, because it does create a bit of challenges for us to not have that clarity.
On the building side, is it all about the building code, or how is there more to regulation that affects peak power and Brainbox?
I think Peak takes it from a bit of a different lens, given that we are very involved in the energy markets. Certainly, just at a high level on the building side, one thing that regulations often forget are the retrofit and existing stock. Like, as an example, Toronto Green Building Standard usually focuses on new builds. Well, what about the buildings that are in place, right? But, to put a different twist on it, I mean, Peak playing in the energy sector, and anyone in the sector will know that the biggest shift has been the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in the United States passing FERC Order 2222. Really what that means is that small energy resources like rooftop solar, small batteries, even bidirectional EVs can now participate in similar energy markets as like your nuclear power plants, for instance. That's a gross oversimplification, but that's the gist of it. Now, what does that mean, right? The thing with energy markets is pricing, like as there's more demand and the grid becomes more strained, pricing gets higher. And you see this as well in Ontario through some mechanisms, but fundamentally, there's a pretty strong correlation between when electricity is most expensive and when gas-fired peaker plants are firing, for example. So the highest emitting times are also the most expensive. And now with FERC Order 2222, by unlocking the potential to participate in these revenue streams for buildings, I mean, that now creates not only an incentive to reduce your usage during the most expensive times, but by proxy, it also unlocks essentially putting the environment on the balance sheet where, oh, if I reduce my emissions during these times, I also get paid to do so because there's an electricity market revenue for it.
Sam, I'm going to shift here to another question with a focus on international clients. I know that Brainbox does a lot of business outside of Canada, and I'm very curious to get a sense of how Canada compares to your international clients in terms of, interest in decarbonization, as well as the willingness to take on the risk of adopting new innovation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I will try to answer it somewhat delicately as I go through it. But like we all know, Europe's typically ahead of the game in terms of everything around decarbonization, and so that's a reflection also around their interest in looking at new technology and making that happen in the built environment and in many other industries. Yeah, you have other one-off countries. Australia is very advanced on building efficiency. So, footprint there has grown really quickly. And then you have some surprising ones, which is like the Middle East is growing very, very quickly for us. And you might have thought the opposite when it comes to decarbonization goals, but it's one that's going very quickly. For sure, I think Canada has a pretty good standing in the world around the efforts we're making. But at the same time, I think as a whole, we're kind of a little bit slower moving, if I can put it that way. And so, and then you go down the list of industries that are slower moving than others, and real estate is right there in terms of a fairly traditional sector. So definitely, it is a bit slower than you would have liked or wanted to see. Same time, a couple of things. The comments we made a few minutes ago, things have changed dramatically in 2 years around the pressures and the desires to take make decarbonization plans and put them in place. And then the second thing is, the pressure is on from a legislative perspective. I don't mean to go backwards here, but New York put in place a pretty, I don't want to call it draconian, but pretty close standards around building efficiency, with real penalties that are coming in the next 2-3 years to building owners that don't move their building up certain grades. Montreal announced plan to do something similar, though it'll be a few years before that's in place. I believe Toronto's on its way as well. So that trend is definitely, that's a train that has left the station, and it's definitely a trend. So I do see us definitely kind of catching up pretty quickly, but for sure there's other parts of the world that are moving faster than we are.
Curious to know why that is. Like, Mike, Cameron, do you have any thoughts on it? Is it cultural? Is it just like we have like a typically conservative culture here in Canada from the corporate perspective, as well as government, which will get into my next question?
Yeah, go ahead. I think it's both. It's a question we both want to answer very delicately, of course, as Sam mentioned there. I mean, I'll speak first.
But it's not, it's not a secret, right? Like, everybody's been talking about this for a long time.
I think, if we're comparing Europe and North America, right? I spent a brief stint over there, and generally I get the sense that, when you're setting ESG targets or even funding innovative pilot projects, it's because, look, climate change at the end of the day is an existential threat, and something has to be done, right? And it seems like, it's like, let's do the demonstrations, let's experiment, let's see what works. If some fail, that's okay. That's a natural part of the process. And the US, of course, exemplifies this with their sort of models of innovation of, how quickly can we move? Of course, understanding that real estate and energy, right? Like, these are hard infrastructure assets. It's not like software where you can move quickly. There's a bug in the code. Okay, let's fix it. If there's a bug in the grid, an entire province goes down, right? But it's certainly like, I think there is a sense that Canada is advanced in some ways, but in other ways it's, hold on, let's see what the US is doing first. I recently saw a report that said, well, hold on, we're going to see how FERC Order 2222 goes first before we begin discussions around how to implement it here. So it's kind of a wait and see approach.
Yeah, I would say Canada can be a little risk adverse when it comes to industry and policy at times. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but there is a risk aversion that I definitely encounter here that I don't encounter in conversations with international clients as well. And I think it depends on how ambitious their goals are and how big the appetite is for failure too, right? If you have a big appetite for failure and a big enough budget to throw at it, there is, like Mike mentioned, especially in the EU, and understanding that we need to throw everything we can at climate change, acknowledging that a lot of things will fail, but some are going to stick. And it's a bit of a different approach. That being said, even with the maybe a kind of historical risk aversion, especially when it comes to startup culture, like you'll see Canadian startups are radically undervalued compared to Silicon Valley startups. You look at the early valuation based on ARR, look at the growth based on revenue. It's far, far, far bolder in the States than it is in Canada. That's just the reality. That being, like, even all that being said, I still feel like Canada is pretty ambitious in this domain. We've got pretty ambitious climate targets. We're planting 2 billion trees net new on top of the billion we pretty much plant every single year. But yeah, I would say that risk appetite is different between countries for sure.
All right, well, let's discuss this within the government procurement context then. You know, we haven't really tackled that one. And speaking of being diplomatic here, but you know, there has been a lot of talk about government procurement of clean tech over the years. So I'm very curious to see what you are all seeing in practice. Like, is it moving too slowly? As you mentioned, is that aversion to risk still there? Is there a fear of taking the political risk to take a chance on new innovations when it comes to adoption? Sam?
You're doing this on
Who's
purpose.
going first?
Doing it on purpose, Tyler, but all right. I'll bite, because I don't know any better. Look, this is definitely a problem area when we talk with other clean techs here in Canada and abroad. It's a problem everywhere, really, but it's a real issue because, you know, on the one hand, here we are creating these you know, organizations, programs, tax credits, you name it, to try to support innovation, ground level, you know, get some champions being built, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the other hand, you know, you see kind of capital allocation decisions that are done in the traditional way, and you know, it doesn't help the cause. And I'll point to in our case, and it impacts Mike as well, but you know, a year and a bit ago, announcement of $2 billion by the federal government being put to work to help and support initiatives to, you know, make buildings greener, if I could simplify it that way. Great. That's exciting. Great news. We go ring the doorbell. Well, you know, unfortunately, we can only support the capital investments. So things that require bricks and mortar. Well, hold on. So what's the point of supporting AI and everything that the promise, et cetera, and then have that kind of condition and we can't access even $1 of it? You know, it's very counter. And you know, Michael will probably have something similar to share on the energy side. I mean, it's a real issue out there. Second point on procurement, that's a delicate one. And I will say, look, I'm from Montreal. We went through our kind of, let's say, city municipal procurement scandal a few years back, right? So we've lived it. Procurement rules are there for a reason, but also those are particularly painful when it comes to deploying innovation and deploying it quickly. So I don't know if there's a balance to strike there. I don't pretend to know the answers fully, because I have we've all seen the dark side of procurement gone wrong. But the problem is, given this climate fight, you know, we can't let inertia be our biggest enemy, right? So we have to somehow start pushing that boundary a bit and figuring out how to balance good procurement rules, but that are able to move quickly and that are open to innovation. I'll stop there.
And it's not I would imagine it's not an across the board thing, right? Like you could imagine things being designed to allocate 5, maybe 10% of procurement budgets to that innovation stuff, right?
Yeah.
And being really upfront about this being a riskier pot of money, but it's a necessary investment to test out these new innovations, which are going to be the growth engine of the 21st century, right? Mike, Cameron, like, do you think that there's room to kind of take those creative approaches?
Yeah, I think there certainly can be, and you know, obviously credit where credit is due. There are certain programs like you know, the most recent IESO, Ontario Energy Board joint call for funding. That's actually, you know, that's, I think, something that's really doing a lot to help drive innovation in the energy sector. But certainly, you know, especially when you're dealing with legacy industry, I'd say that a certain appreciation is required for the delta between what a small company life cycle looks like versus what an established player's life cycle might look like. That's one, sort of like how the startup needs to get market traction at home before going abroad. But then secondly, you know, there've been, and some programs are better than others, there've certainly been some programs where, let's say evaluation process is a little bit odd. Like, as an example, there was an innovation procurement we were participating in, and the feedback we got is, well, we're looking for an innovative solution, but can you please show us your 10-year track record of performance? It's like, wait, hold on, that doesn't quite compute for us. But certainly, I mean, budgets allocated towards innovation, you see that in the utility space as well, can lead to quite strong outcomes for this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How's that translate, Cameron, into your area?
I guess I have like a few different views. So like in terms of, you know, the more creative approach and the more like flexible approach from government to kind of fan the winds of innovation, we do have really great programs. Like I noticed SDTC is a sponsor of this. They gave us grant dollars, and the way that
amazing program.
It's amazing for us. And what I love about what they did is, like, it's federal funding for risky innovations, but they're vetted innovations. And before you get the funding, you need to prove out that you have partners that are going to come in to match the funding as you scale, that you have an aggressive growth strategy, that you're validating the tech all the way through, that you're validating the customer segment, and the kind of market prices and all those market factors as you scale, and you report continually to get the funding. That seems like the perfect balance, because you're getting this money from government to innovate, to be creative, getting a little bit of freedom to fail, but also showing like you're not just throwing money at anything, you're throwing money at those that you're kind of hedging on, you think have a good chance of success. So yeah, those programs I think are an absolutely fantastic middle ground. When it comes to larger procurement, we're going to see, I do absolutely anticipate we're going to come up against some walls, because there's an entrenched industry, and every time you're an innovator, there's a growing pain where it's you versus the incumbent. Happens with any industry. It happened with trains and automobiles, horses and trains. It happened with our cell phones and telephone lines, and it's going to happen with all of these decarbonization programs. But I'm still optimistic.
Yeah, and in addition to SDTC, Emissions Reduction Alberta has a similar approach, and I know some of you have benefited from that. And it is super important getting those first projects going. I guess in Canada, it's a term I've been using more frequently, but pilot purgatory, like trying to get beyond one pilot after another and starting to get follow-on orders. And those programs like SDTCs and ERAs are meant to try to do that, but the pull into the follow-on adoption has been a little trickier, I imagine, for a lot of companies.
Yeah.
I'm gonna just move on. We have some audience questions here, so I figured I'd throw some in here. So this is to all of you. The question is about how you, what you're doing to globalize your products. So, for example, how you're internationalizing the software you produce. So in your case, Mike and Sam, is there a different approach to how your software needs to be positioned and programmed, technical documentation and localization from that perspective? Can you guys talk to some of the trickiness of adapting your product for those international markets?
Yeah, so on the energy side, there's certainly a lot of localization that needs to be done. But it's all about finding the similarities in energy markets. Like, for example, Ontario's energy market is different from Quebec's, is different from New York City, is different from Maryland, right? Everyone has its own nuances and differences in terms of the programs that are implemented. But at the end of the day, they're all based in similar types of revenue streams, which are around, reducing demand or exporting during a certain time or providing fast frequency response. Really, the tricky part at that point is just understanding the market rules. And once you get a broad enough data set to find the commonalities, then it becomes fairly straightforward. It still takes 3 to 4 months, I'd say, to enter a new market from an energy perspective, but certainly that's what Peak's doing in terms of understanding what the base revenue streams and functions are, and then making sure that they're scaled appropriately for each energy market.
Sam, I know when you sell your product, like one of the beauties about your product is that you're able to almost ship it and have it be like, send it with instructions to self-install. It's not that simple, but you've positioned it in a way where it's relatively easy for your international clients to implement. But it still requires that translation component if you're providing instructional videos or other documentation. Has that been a barrier at all, or are you finding that navigating that world has been okay for you?
You're right in that the software being, the artificial intelligence layer being number one, it's housed in the cloud. It has to be, given the computing power required. And that means our reach is global. So anywhere that has a mobile telephone network and a cloud network is available to us. And that's today almost every country out there, frankly. So that makes things easier. I think our challenges are somewhat cultural, just in how we present technology and the willingness to adopt technology. Somewhat language, although frankly, a lot of the buildings out there use the same global systems brands that we all recognize from the industrial sector, and so there's a lot of English speaking going on, regardless of what country you're in when it comes to this area. Same, I think, would apply to energy as well. So I think in that space we're fortunate. So I don't want to use that ease of doing business abroad to make it seem like it should be easy everywhere. I know there are real challenges out there, especially for clean tech companies, to reach into sectors. Plus, buildings are not really regulated. So when Mike has to step into an energy market in the UK, well, holy molasses, it's a whole batch of new regulations you need to understand. In our case, a building's a building, and there's usually very few regulations. So from that perspective, we're quite lucky, and we end up in some really interesting countries. We recently hit Pakistan, Thailand, Japan, ones that weren't necessarily a big focus area for us, but lots of interest to work on decarbonization. So that's the 2 cents I can provide there.
Cameron, I wouldn't suspect that you would face the same issues, but maybe you do, like as you're looking at opportunities elsewhere.
We have our own set of challenges because we're, first of all, a very CapEx heavy company. And second of all, we're playing with nature, which is very unpredictable. So it would be so much easier for us to go across borders if we were a SaaS company. That being said, I think what one of our biggest learnings was as a company, and it would probably be applicable to anyone observing this who's got their own startup and is looking at growing across borders, drill in early a very robust go, no go. So you got 195 countries to choose from when you're going abroad. Have a good go, no go where you quantify, you have verifiable metrics where you're quantifying that country, that market. What's the scalability potential? What's the impact potential? What's the ease of access? What's the regulatory environment look like? How much is it going to cost you to get there? Once you get there, you validated your tech, you have a market. Then how much is it going to cost you to scale? Once you have a go, no go like that, it helps you really dial in your expansion plans. And for us, we were super bold at the beginning. We had, I think, it was like over 40 different countries reached out, wanted us to go, and we're like, we want to do all of it. And then once we actually applied that kind of methodology where you're quantifying and qualifying these different opportunities and different markets, it really drilled in our list and made it a much easier decision for us to say no. And that's kind of your first big challenge. You have to say no when you're going international, a lot more than you say yes.
But what you're pointing out there, it brings it back to the whole issue of adoption in Canada, right? Because if you have limited resources as an early stage venture, you have to pick those markets that are the path of least resistance, right? And you can only spend time focusing on getting business in Canada for so long until you get pulled elsewhere. So that really positions it as a missed opportunity for the Canadian market if our own homegrown ventures have to just reallocate those resources to go international.
It's very true. And I think if we came up against some glass ceilings in Canada, or we felt like market adoption was taking too long or the regulatory framework wasn't allowing for it, we would absolutely be focusing more resources abroad, for sure. You got to go, as a startup, you need the low-hanging fruit. You got to go where it's easiest first, because most startups fail. Set yourselves up for success wherever that happens.
Yeah, I assume Mike, Sam, you share that thought. Yeah.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly, yeah, like it's for us, it's, you know, you know, I've heard the approach of look at North America as one market, and in some cases, I think that's kind of what we've had to do, just because the US, there's certain aspects of it that are much more favorable for us than sort of our home market. Toronto and Ontario are still our largest, to be sure, but the US, especially with the passage of Order 2222 and other regulatory structures, it's ramping up quite quickly for us. And, you know, it's quickly catching up, if not exceeding, what the opportunity is in Canada.
I think in our case, it would be less country than it would be, you know, back to the question about, you know, working with government procurement. I mean, we'll get a building faster in Jordan from a private owner than we will get our first building from the, you know, any level of government, provincial or federal in Canada. I mean, it's just an unfortunate reality. So what do you do, right?
Yeah.
Like Cameron is saying, you really have no choice.
Yeah. So we have a few minutes left. It wouldn't be a Mission for Mars panel without some shameless self-promotion here. So the questions I'm going to throw out to all three of you is, what have you benefited the most from so far, knowing that this is a program that's still rolling, in your participation in Mission for Mars? Have you found the program beneficial, and what are you hoping to get out of it? Let's start with, let's go back to you, Sam.
Sure, thank you. And I can assure you, Tyler and his team do not pay us anything to make the following comments. But we've been a member of MaRS, and then more recently a member of Mission from Mars for a couple of years now, and we are very big fans. As you're getting a sense from this group here of Cleantech startups, it's all about effort and getting to market and getting pilots and getting over those hurdles. And just the sheer voice that a platform like Mission for Mars and MaRS itself gives us is amazing. It has been an incredibly active group, just exchanging with the other members of the Mission for Mars teams as well. We see each other on panels like this. We see each other when we used to have events, etc. It's to me tremendously powerful. The team does an amazing job there. So again, not paid for commentary. You get nothing back, but it is a really heartfelt opinion when it regards to the efforts that the whole MaRS organization is doing. So
it's a risky question, because you guys can say whatever you want. But Mike, have you found it beneficial so far, and what do you hope to get out of it?
Yeah, I mean, certainly from us, again, the MaRS has been a long time supporter of Peak, so certainly it's amplified the Peak Power name even further. And then of course, you know, Tyler, the depth and breadth of your connections never ceases to amaze me. It seems like whatever, it's like, oh, okay, let's try to find a connection with this organization. It's usually you just say, oh yeah, I know someone there. So that's been actually quite amazing there. But then, you know, specific to the program, I think what I appreciate about it is you pulling in stakeholders that Pete typically wouldn't engage with in a meaningful manner. It would mostly be in passing, but the ability to bring stakeholders that are from outside of the bubble that we participate in. I mean, that's really excited to see the perspectives they bring and how they can support us. And, you know, of course, from us, the end goal, to be blunt, is to see how many more sites we might be able to get in Canada. But, you know, with the team you've been putting together and the Mission for Mars has been putting together, I'm really confident that we'll be able to do that.
Absolutely. And Cameron, your last chance to slam us before you get the last word.
Well, I'll be honest, at the beginning, I was skeptical about us joining another program like this. When we got in, we definitely had reservations, because we were in a number of accelerators last year, and at, you know, a certain point it becomes more work than value add. And I've been very pleasantly surprised with this Mission from Mars program. Like Mike was saying, networks. Tyler, you're very, very well networked. And I think you guys as an organization are quite keen not to be a burden, but to be an asset, not to burden, but to nurture. And so when you reach out to us, you recognize that we're busy, just like you would with all of your startups. You're really trying to be a value add, and you're trying to create connections and have very strategic calls that you know will be beneficial to our organization, not just so Mars can, inject itself in our operations. You guys are being very strategic about how you can create value and add value to us. So I'm absolutely a fan now. I had my reservations at the beginning, but you guys have you've converted me. So yeah, I
Well,
definitely would recommend it.
I'm happy to hear that. And I do realize it's a balance between not wanting to overwhelm you guys with communications and respecting the fact that you're very busy, but hopefully you're finding that there is value in those touch points. So, and we hope to continue to do that over the coming months. Listen, guys, thank you very much for a very engaging panel. I really appreciate you taking the time in your very busy schedules to do this. Before I conclude this panel, I do want to recognize, though, because it's kind of like obvious, we've got 4 white guys sitting on this panel. It lacks diversity.
Yeah.
I just want to point out that there's always an effort on our part and on the part of every organization to try to get a good mix, but unfortunately scheduling conflicts prevented that from happening for certain team members. So apologies to the audience. We're trying, but didn't work out for this particular panel. And with that, thanks everybody again. And I hope everybody watching enjoys the rest of this amazing conference.